There's a phrase that should make every leader sit up. That's just how we do it here. And that phrase isn't necessarily wrong, but it is the language of something that's never really been quite decided, isn't it? It's the language of something that's been tolerated and accepted and then perhaps forgotten. Now, today, I want to take you back to a teleconference. There were two rooms, and they were hundreds of miles apart. It was a Thursday evening in January 1986. I want you to imagine engineers shouting into a phone line and vice presidents going quiet. There was a decision that had already been made 9 years before anyone picked up the phone that night. This is a story of how the workaround became how we do it, and what that cost. By the mid-1980s, the Space Shuttle program was no longer being run as an experimental science program. It was now being run on a flight rate. The public, they'd been promised that there would be 15 flights a year. But then with that came a pressure to ensure that the cost per launch came down. Both Congress and commercial customers were watching. And with a New Hampshire schoolteacher, Christopher McAuliffe, about to fly into space, well, the country, if not the world, was about to be watching too. So this all brings pressure. This pressure is starting to rise. And you may or you may not be surprised to learn that the first thing to disappear when this pressure starts to build is rarely a procedure. Often what gets missed first is a conversation. So it might be a check-in with someone that gets skipped because we're a bit too busy, or maybe a challenge that doesn't get raised. It could be a concern. Well, maybe the concern is noted and then it is logged and then we file it away, but then it gets closed off and it gets forgotten about. So if that's the pressure in the story, let's have a look at what that pressure was burying. Because the signals were there. They had been since before the shuttle ever flew. In 1977, a test had shown that under ignition pressure, the joint in the solid rocket booster, that's the joint that held the O-ring seals in place, bent in the wrong direction. This reduced the pressure on the seal instead of increasing it. So the design actually behaved the opposite of how it had ever been intended. Now, 2 years later, in January 1979, there was a NASA Marshall engineer called Leon Ray. Now, Leon, he wrote a memo. He actually spoke up and he called Thiokol's position that the joint was adequate completely unacceptable. He said, under ignition, the secondary O-ring, so that's the redundancy that's being relied on if the first one fails, could become disengaged. He was saying that there was no real backup. So this means that the flight was already, in 1979, more dangerous than the people who were flying believed at the time. Now let's fast forward that 8 years to January 1985 to a flight called 51C. Now this flight launched on the coldest day in shuttle history to that point. And when the boosters were recovered, well, the O-ring erosion was the worst they had ever seen. So this is the point where engineers are starting to formally link erosion to cold. A few months later, in April 1985, we had a flight called 51B. Now, a primary O-ring on a nozzle joint failed entirely on that flight. The only thing that stopped a burn through was the secondary seal. So the redundancy that that design had assumed is actually becoming a redundancy that the design really does genuinely need. And then another few months later, in July of that same year, a Thiokol engineer called Boisjoly wrote a memo to his vice president of engineering. And he used a phrase that, with hindsight, reads a bit like a warning that's been shouted into a sealed room. The result, he wrote, would be a catastrophe of the highest order. Loss of human life. So a task force was set up. Within weeks, though, Boisjoly reported that it had no power, no resources, and no management support. Let's look at the part of that story that matters the most. Over those months, between the memo and the launch, we can see something's happening with that language. The words have moved over those 9 years. We've gone from O-ring erosion. So that was the original phrase. That was the original problem. And then it became somewhere along the line acceptable erosion. So still a problem, but now it's a sanctioned one. And then the phrase within the experience base was used. And that sounds almost reassuring. And by the time it reached the flight readiness review, it's become a green tick. So it was the very same thing, the very same problem every time. The problem hadn't changed, but the words did. The engineers, they were still worried. They wrote it down and they flagged it and they presented it, but the system around them just stopped being worried with them. And then it was January 1986. There's a sociologist called Diane Vaughan who, 10 years after the disaster, wrote a book about all of this, The Challenger Launch Decision. It's possibly one of the most important books ever written about why organisations fail. And she gave the pattern a name. She called it Normalisation of Deviance. And her argument is simple. And once you've heard it, you'll probably see it everywhere. But it goes like this. So you have a behaviour, such as a workaround or a deviation or a tolerance, and it first appears. And the first time it happens, people notice and they flag it and they talk about it and it gets put on slides and presented in meetings. And then it happens again. But nothing bad happens. So the next time that it happens, that alarm sounds a little bit quieter. And then the time after that, well, perhaps there isn't an alarm at all. It doesn't get raised. It doesn't get put on a slide. And so eventually you reach a meeting where the deviation is just so familiar that nobody actually remembers when it stopped being a deviation. And that's what happened at NASA between 1977 and 1986. Not because anybody was reckless and wanted a disaster, but because every flight that didn't fail became evidence that the design was working, when actually it was evidence that the design had been lucky. So now picture the teleconference. It's the evening of January the 27th, 1986. The overnight temperature in Florida is forecast to fall to 18 degrees Fahrenheit, or minus 7 degrees Celsius. So colder than any launch in history. Boisjoly and a colleague named Arnie Thompson, they present the data, and they recommend no launch below 53 degrees, or 11 degrees Celsius. Now, the response from NASA Marshall is 2 sentences that are quite unforgettable. The first was from Larry Malloy, the booster project manager. He said, "My God, Firecall, when do you want me to launch? Next April?" The second, from George Hardy, his deputy director, he said he's appalled by the recommendation. Now, Firecall asks for a 5-minute offline discussion. It's actually lasted 30, understandably. But let's think about inside that room in Utah, where we've got the senior vice president, a man called Jerry Mason. And he turns to the vice president of engineering, Bob Lund, and says, the line that has become the most famous sentence in history of organisational failure of all time. It's time to take off your engineering hat and put on your management hat. At this, Lund changes his vote and the recommendation reverses. NASA is told the launch is a go. A man called Alan McDonald, the senior Firecall representative in Florida, refuses to sign the launch authorization himself, but somebody else signs it for him. That evening, Bob Ebling from Firecall goes home and he sits down next to his wife and says in an extremely mundane voice that you might say, the kettle is boiling, he tells her, it's going to blow up. So if we take all that into account, we can see that it wasn't an O-ring failure. It was a meeting failure that happened to involve an O-ring. Now, you're not running a space program. but you are perhaps running something. And before you go back to your week, there are 4 questions that I just want you to think about. 4 questions I'm going to ask you. So where in your organization over the last 6 months has that language softened? So has there been a concern that's quietly become manageable, or where a workaround became just the way we do it? Is there a number that used to require a discussion? Has that just become a number on a slide? A number that nobody's talking about anymore? Now, that's not a rhetorical question. I genuinely want you to name one. I want you to have a think about that. The second thing is, what did you hear yesterday? Whether it was in a meeting or in a corridor or a one-to-one, that if you heard it again next week, you might describe as a pattern. Because the moment a deviation becomes a pattern, well, let's think back. That's the moment a flight readiness review starts to lie. And then the danger is, it's not that nobody's noticed. The danger is that everyone noticed, but nobody's actually said anything. The third question, I want you to have a think about this one seriously, is who in your meeting tends to start sentences with, I might be missing something, but... And then what happens to those sentences? Because that one sentence and what you actually do with it is a very important piece of data, one of the most important pieces of safety data that your team will perhaps produce all year. Boisjoly didn't stay silent. He wrote it down. 6 months before the Challenger flew, he put his warning in a memo and he sent it up the chain. It was received, it was filed, and it was not acted upon. So is someone in your organization, are they writing a memo right now? And where does that memo usually end up? Question 4, which of your reports are showing green right now, while the people doing the work are actually a little bit stretched? I see this so often, because that's the question I want every chair of every committee to be asking every month before they accept an operations update. And it's the one question that nobody in that 27th of January teleconference asked. And not because nobody could have, but because if they had asked, by then it would have been the unusual thing to do. Now, if you'd like the full 5-set question, I know I only gave you 4, but there is 5. So the one I haven't given you there, the link is in the description below. It's free and it's a 1-page, and it's the conversation guide I'd use in your next board meeting. On the morning of the 28th of January, 1986, the ground crew at Kennedy Space Center found icicles on the launch pad. The temperature on the gantry was 36 degrees Fahrenheit, 2 degrees Celsius. So 15 degrees colder than any shuttle had ever launched in. Challenger lifted off at 11:38 in the morning. 73 seconds later, it was gone. The crew was 7 people. Francis Scobie, the commander, Michael Smith, the pilot, Ellison Onizuka, Judith Resnick, Ronald McNair, Gregory Jarvis, and Krista McCauliffe. And I name them because the temptation in a story like this is to keep the focus on the meeting rooms. But the meeting rooms didn't pay for the meeting rooms' decisions. A few weeks later, on the 11th of February, this Richard Feynman was sitting on the Presidential Commission, and he asked for a glass of water. He took a small clamp out of his pocket and he compressed a piece of O-ring material in the clamp. He held it under the water, and when he pulled it out, the rubber stayed compressed. It lost its spring bank. It was a demonstration that engineers had been trying to give for 9 years. Feynman's appendix to the Commission's report, 6 pages, is one of the most quoted documents in the literature, and it closes with one sentence. For a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, because nature cannot be fooled. Here's the question I'd leave you with. What does your organization measure? And what does it just assume is fine because nobody else has said otherwise? NASA measured launch readiness. They had charts, they had data, and they had sign-off procedures. But what they didn't measure was whether the people signing off felt safe enough to say no. Challenger didn't fail because nobody was paying attention. It failed because all the attention was in the wrong place. Now, if this has been useful, then please subscribe. The 5 question set link is in the description below. And if you know someone who sits on a board or chairs a committee or sits in any room where a green tick gets handed up the chain, then share this with them, because that's how the conversation moves on. And share your experience, share your comments below.